Okay, well, welcome everyone this evening to our event entitled The World is a Dumpster Fire. This event tonight is going to be a panel discussion hosted by the Department of Campus Climate, and we have three panelists joining us here tonight. So why a dumpster fire, or more specifically, why did we create this event? We kind of collectively put our minds together, Kaden, myself, and Frank, and we really felt like there was so much to talk about. There's a lot to unpack, a lot to educate about, particularly of the ongoing events of this year, but really every other year before, our terrible 2020 as well. And most specifically, though, this year we have all been experiencing personal and collective ongoing trauma. And we felt that in many ways, there's been a tendency towards dismissal of this trauma or of the egregious events that people have been experiencing. So, for example, dismissing the impact or the severity of COVID, in dismissing experiences of racial trauma or police brutality, just saying, things, just keeping that very blanketed mindset of, oh, things will get better, things are not as bad as they seem. And so we really feel like people are not also able to just name what they've been going through, either individually within their communities or nationally. And we felt that a time and space to actually shape and name this is extremely important, especially as a lot of students may be going and moving back home or just away from the academic setting through the summer months. Maybe they won't be as connected to peers or resources on campus as they typically are. And same for staff and faculty. Just any shift in normalcy or routine right now can be even more impactful or disruptive. And we wanted to provide this before the end of the semester to really give some tools or insight of how can we manage this moving forward. And wanted a space to kind of take a step beyond self-care, and really talk about what happens when I do experience something traumatic or I am feeling extremely stressed or escalated. What are some tools and reframes and mindsets that I can take to kind of move forward, but also think and really reflect on that situation. And so, like I said, we have some panelists tonight to share their personal and professional expertise for managing this ongoing trauma that we've all experienced in various ways. A little bit of logistics for tonight. So we do have three panelists. We have Teresa Miller, Dr. Loucresie Rupert, and Jeffrey Lujan. They are going to be answering 4 questions each, and then we'll have a Q&A to follow. So please feel free to utilize the Zoom chat throughout this discussion to either privately or publicly message Kaden or Frank. They will be monitoring the Zoom chat. And, we'll have a chance at the end to have more of a dialogue in a Q&A. This event is being recorded to make it accessible for those who are unable to attend live. And finally, I just wanted to share ways to engage. So like I said, we will have a panel, but if there is something pertinent that you'd like to ask throughout, we please ask you to use the raise your hand feature. You can always talk or ask questions in the Zoom chat, either publicly or privately throughout this. And you can feel free to use the reaction or the smiley emoji button to use the reaction. Zoom has updated to having a lot of ways to choose to react. So we do ask you if you're going to react, please do so respectfully. Maybe no poop emojis, just know that this is a respectful space. Okay. Well, now is the time for me to stop talking completely and turn things over a little bit to our panelists. So I'm going to start out with Dr. Rupert and ask that you tell us a little bit about yourself and your work.
So my name is Loucresie Rupert. I am a child psychiatrist. Well, I'm actually adult, adolescent, and child trained. I did my undergrad, medical school, and adult residency at University of South Alabama in Mobile, Alabama, and my child fellowship at UAB in Birmingham, Alabama. So I'm obviously from the South. Been here about 4 years. I currently work at Gunderson and see kids with all diagnoses, and then I see adults with developmental disabilities. I also do, so I have a consultant company called Insightful Consultant that I do corporate trainings in additional to like personal coaching. So like personal anti-racism coaching, parenting, neurodiversity. So, you know, ADHD type coaching, things like that. And I so-called have a blog, but I haven't written on the blog in quite a while. But that's called Under One Umbrella, where I really just write about my life experience. I'm neurodiverse myself and have some mental health diagnosis, and I'm an adoptive mom, and I have special needs kids. And so I really just kind of write about my life experiences or things that are going on in the public that relates to either mental health or neurodiversity or adoption generally, are the three that I generally cover.
Great. Thank you so much for being here. And for others kind of in the space tonight, both Dr. Rupert and Jeff were part of a conference recently at UW-Platteville led by LSU, or our Latinx student leadership group. So we're welcoming them back to the space as well. Teresa, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your work?
Yeah, thanks everyone for joining. I'm Teresa Miller, and I am an MSW. So I have been working at Platteville as a college mental health counselor, and now assistant director of the counseling services office. And I have been working there. My master's is from the University of Chicago, and while there, I focused on the transition from high school to college for the students who attended the Chicago public high schools. And so I did 2 years of internship in that environment and really found I fell in love with that age group of young adults who are making that transition, and kind of remembered my own experience growing up, not sure what I wanted to be, but always wanting to know I wanted to help people. And so finding to provide counseling and support, and especially being able to help individuals address and heal trauma through a safe relationship is I just find it a great privilege to be able to work and find my profession in this field. So I am happy to join everyone and share my experiences.
Thank you, Teresa, and thank you as well for being here tonight. Jeff, can you share a little bit about yourself and your work?
Certainly. Well, my name is Jeff Lujan. I currently live in Colorado Springs, Colorado. My undergraduate was in education from the University of Hawaii in Manoa. I taught in the state of Hawaii as a school teacher for 10 years at a Hawaiian language immersion program. And while I was first person in 100 years to teach high school science through the Hawaiian language. So I always like to joke that initially the curriculum was really out of date. Spent a lot of time doing translations. And then it was while I was working there, then they shifted me into a counseling position, because especially back then, there just weren't a lot of counselors that could provide that support through the Hawaiian language medium. But that's what got me interested in, I guess, counseling and mental health services. I went back to school and got my degree in my master's in social work. I got that I started off at the University of Hawaii and finished up at Colorado State University here in Colorado. That's why I moved here. Since then, I've worked in youth care. I did a little bit of a stint in addictions counseling. But mostly I've done a lot of work in end-of-life care. So I currently work and have been for the past 13 years in hospice, working as a hospice social worker. I also have been doing a lot of work in Canada with different youth service organizations and residential treatment facilities, teaching about alternative ways to deal with dysregulation and traumatized youth. So I've been doing a lot of work with that. I work with an organization called National Center for School Engagement. We've done some work on the Pine Ridge Reservation, and currently we're in collaboration organization with the Wind River Reservation, which is the Arapaho and Shoshone Reservation up in Wyoming. Yeah, I think it's through that work or those circles, Native American circles, that I met with Angela Miller, and she kind of got me connected up with you folks. So it's that's a little bit a nutshell of what I've been doing, but I'm really happy to be here tonight. So thank you guys for inviting me.
Thank you, Jeff. And I feel like a nutshell, even though you've described like 40 million things that you've done. But yeah, I would say that's a good condensing of all the facets of life you've worked in. So back to Dr. Rupert, the first question, or the second, I suppose, that we have is, how has the mental health of marginalized communities been impacted by collective trauma this last year? And what are some obstacles to seeking support? We also want to invite each of the panelists to really speak to communities you feel most comfortable with or even identifying with. So really to take that word marginalized in whatever way you feel and you want to speak to. So I'll just repeat the question one more time with that caveat is, how has the mental health of marginalized communities been impacted by collective trauma of this last year, and what are obstacles to seeking support?
So I guess the most obvious marginalized communities I'm a part of is Black and female, but I'm also neurodiverse and LGBTQ. But I would say for the Black community, there's been kind of like two pandemics, right? So there's the violence against Black people, and then COVID. And as far as how we've been impacted, I think with social media, which can be helpful, like with finding community supportive communities, but it also can be very triggering, right? When everybody's sharing story after story of this happened, this person got shot, this person was, this kid in school was. I just saw a story where the person wasn't Black, but it was a Latino immigrant child that was paddled in Florida by her principal, which paddling is actually allowed in some places still, but it was not allowed there. And she didn't have permission to be doing that. And mom was kind of scared to step in because of her immigrant status. So kind of that barrage of trauma that we can like now see all day long. I feel like that has negatively affected marginalized communities, and then not being able to get out and socialize and kind of have those support groups that you're used to having has kind of doubled that. At the same time, there's been some increase in access with virtual therapy and things like that. But I think for the most part, this has been a hard year for everyone. I think it's been a lot of like people just learning boundaries. Like you have to learn to take a break. You have to learn when it's time to step up and ask for help. Like I even took a couple months off of work this year. Just with everything outside going on and everything in my family, I was like, yep, no, I need some time. So, which is actually something that was really hard for me to do, right? Because I've been working since I was 14. I've never taken extended time off work. So thankfully I had a supportive psychiatrist and therapist who was like, yes, you need to do this. And I was like, really? You think it's okay? But, learning those boundaries, learning to take care of yourself. And like you said in the beginning, take care of yourself, not as in what we think of self-care, which you need to do those things too, but not as what we think of self-care of like taking baths and getting massages, which are all great and definitely do those things. But saying no, getting therapy, those types of self-care that's really caring for your whole physical, spiritual, and mental self.
Thank you. And could you speak a little bit more to what are some obstacles that you feel are out there for marginalized folks in seeking mental health support or getting the support they need for this ongoing trauma, not only this year, but every other year prior as well.
Yeah, so I think part of the issue is that you just said it's ongoing trauma. So generally for PTSD or for trauma, we take the person out of the traumatic space and then give them tools to cope with like the leftover, what's the word I'm looking for? The leftover emotions from that, but we can't be taken out of this traumatic space we're here. So learning how to deal with trauma in a place where you're constantly being re-traumatized is difficult. So that's an obstacle, is that you're just constantly being re-traumatized. The other is there's not enough psychiatrists and therapists. There's especially not enough psychiatrists and therapists of color who it's just a numbers game. Like there's just not enough of us for people to get to. I think my waiting list is like a year long. Then, insurance, like a lot of insurances, even so-called good insurance, have really crappy mental health coverage. Finding a competent therapist. So like I tell people all the time, there's lots of different types of therapy. So sometimes people will go and have a bad experience and give up on therapy, not realizing they might need a different type, or they just might need a different therapist that has more of their same experience. So I think literally being able to get into mental health care is a barrier. Then in our communities, Black communities, most communities of color, I think in the United States, kind of have a mental health stigma. And you're just supposed to suck it up and be strong. And Black people don't go to the therapist. That's what white people do. We're stronger than that. We've had to deal with slavery and we got through it. Although we didn't really get through it unscathed, as you can see, but we got through it. So why do you need to go talk to somebody? What can they say? So really breaking down. And I think that I have noticed one thing that I do think social media has helped with is I have noticed a big turn in like people talking openly about seeking mental health. And, it's okay to get a therapist. It's okay. Like in the Black community, one of the things is you don't get a therapist, you pray instead. So now there's like a campaign, like it's okay to have God and a therapist too. And just seeing a lot of that and seeing that kind of be slowly eroded away, I think is one of the positive things of social media. But yeah, that's some of the obstacles we run into, culture and just literally being able to get into that space.
Yeah, and I really appreciate you speaking to the importance of kind of seeing yourself or seeing your own experiences in a therapist as well. I mean, I know that therapists can still provide quality and affirming care when those things aren't in place, but I think like you said, it increases a sense of trust and connection. Yeah, and I think that, in our own spaces, we've talked about the negative impact of social media. So I appreciate you kind of reframing even a few times, just as we're getting started, kind of the positives that have been there too, because I think social media and media in general has been such a negative or overwhelming place for people, particularly throughout 2020 and into 2021 as well. So, Teresa, how has the mental health of marginalized communities been impacted by the collective trauma of this last year? And what are some obstacles in seeking support?
Yeah, when I was thinking about this question, what I really thought was kind of from a trauma-informed perspective, what have I really been aware of? And I know that one of the reasons why this past year has been traumatic for everyone experiencing COVID together is that we are noticing that things are not within our control, and we are being asked to change in ways that are beyond our control and our ability to naturally cope with things. And so when you pile that on top of other marginalized identities, LGBT individuals, women, Black, Indigenous, people of color, who have faced invalidation and generations of harm from society, we start to see really this challenge of this constant emotional arousal and just the ways that plays onto the body. So it plays onto the body with showing up as anxiety or panic attacks. It also shows up as insomnia, inability to kind of sleep or relax, and that withdrawal, like kind of like wanting to self-protect and hide, as well as mood disorders, right? And so those are the things that we kind of think about as trauma causing, but the longer term effects too that can happen is this sense of abandonment and loss, right? This sense of self-hate and shame, because there's this thought like, why am I going to try? Nothing's going to make a difference, right? And so this fixed mindset that can kind of show up through these repeated invalidations. A lot of maybe even survivor's guilt for individuals who have wonder, well, nothing is really wrong in my life. Why am I feeling this bad? Like everything, I should be feeling better. And so kind of invalidating their own self, where they are at and how they are feeling. So I see that as kind of a lot of things that's happened, especially for marginalized communities, when we are shouting self-care, and they need community care, right? And where is that community care gone? In COVID, it's not there anymore. And so I think, what are the obstacles for seeking that support? As a white counselor, I'm pretty aware, and I know that as much as I can try to make sure I am constantly acknowledging and dismantling my own ideas and biases and those systems of prejudice that I exist into, that like it or not, it's complicated and I'm going to make mistakes. And so knowing too, I make mistakes and I need to keep learning and need to keep that energy to stay engaged. When we know that over this past year, so many people are saying that it's just hard to stay engaged with the topic, especially if they have a sense of privilege, right? If they can, in their life, naturally step away from that, remaining engaged, I think, is an obstacle. For people who are not marginalized. But for people who are marginalized too, we know that like human rights are on attack, right? There's been attacks on voting rights. There's been attacks on LGBT trans issues. There have been increased attempts at putting abortion, taking that off of the table, and attacks on health rights from women, and from every area. And so I think right, the nonstop news and hearing about this and notifications and seeing it everywhere has kind of created this sense of where's our rest, and that lack of balance. And so I think we can kind of even get caught in that cycle.
Yeah, I really like what you said about where's the rest. When you said that, I did a verbal I was just muted, but yeah, that feels very true. And the constant barrage and a lot of it being negative, like you said, and affecting marginalized communities, taking rights, being on the line yet again. It's just, it's so much. Yeah. Jeff, so how has the mental health of marginalized communities been impacted by the collective trauma of this last year, and what obstacles are you seeing in folks seeking support?
What I notice is that some of the communities that are really being hit hard are already those that experience isolation and separation from maybe feeling connected with the greater society. And then especially this COVID has exacerbated that, particularly amongst rural Native American communities, where it's already physically isolated, socially isolated, culturally isolated, and then having a sense of historically being marginalized and ignored. That seemed to just become profoundly exacerbated over the year, of 2020 during that COVID. And even the response, I mean, we know that, or some of you may be aware that, for example, the Navajo Nation was profoundly impacted. And the first aid that they got, I mean, physical, tangible aid, was a delivery of body bags. So that rippled through the community, and just like what the hell? If nothing else, just really what the hell? And so that sense of even being further ignored, of course, it paid off in a backlash. One of the deciding votes, if you looked at the county by county map of Arizona, the counties that went blue in Arizona are all the same counties where there are significant Native American reservations or populations. So that came back to, to bite one of the parties in the butt anyways. I think some of the barriers that, and then again with that kind of invisibleness with Native Americans that are, I guess, what we call urban Indians living in urban areas. They tend to be seen as, oh, what are you? You Hispanic? Are you Mexican? Are you some kind of weird Italian? What's going on with that? So there's an invisibility within those communities, even in urban areas, and an experience of a profound detachment from their homes, their reservations or their communities of origin. In the attempt to prevent the spread of COVID, many communities closed access to the communities. And I know many people that are tribal members that could not get onto their own home communities because they're trying to prevent the people from outside or people that have had contact outside from coming in. And so I was just talking to a friend of mine who's a tribal secretary for Pueblo down in New Mexico. And he says, we're really strict even if they're a tribal member, but if their ID card shows that their home address is in Albuquerque, they can't come on. And it's a protective measure. But again, it's that it's an additional trauma to community members. Then when we have the multiple layers of marginalization, if you have, a person that's First Nations or Indigenous, and then they're also a member of LGBTQ community, and now they're seeking mental health services. You have these multiple layers of oppression, marginalization that create barriers to access. So in addition to some of the things that we talked about before, stigma and lack of resources, especially in urban, rural communities, reservations, there's just nothing out there as far as mental health services. It's physical distancing between where people live, with the exception of Pueblo communities, which have always historically been very physically grouped together. But many of the other reservations, whether you go to Pine Ridge or Wind River or the Navajo Nation or the different Apache reservations, people live pretty physically separated from each other. And so on top of the isolation from external community, there's internal isolation that happens with restrictions against, gatherings, large numbers. And that restrictions on gathering have been a huge emotional burden, because one of the most important sources of strength and resilience within those communities are traditional ceremonies. And many communities have taken the approach of canceling ceremony just to protect the community members. And so that thing that became community glue and a source of strength and resilience was also taken away. Then, of course, there's, we talked about lack of resources, lack of culturally relevant or resonant resources, whether it's, for, Hispanic or LGBTQ or, Indigenous peoples. I think those are the, the main things I was thinking of as you were talking about this.
Yeah, thank you. I feel like each of you spoke to just that importance of community care, and I'm hoping that we can. I know that Dr. Rupert, you talked about that is happening online, and has maybe flourished a little bit more quickly over the pandemic than what we saw in the past. But I'm hopeful that those that it can start to flourish, in that it would be safe to do so sometime in the near future. But I know that that's also something we've been saying for a while now. So we'll see.
I have a question. Something
Yeah.
I had a question for Jeff. So, in the Black community, people wanting to take the vaccine is very hit or miss because of the history of experimentation on Black people. And it's that same history in Indigenous communities. So I was just wondering, like, how has the vaccine been received in Indigenous communities?
It's also hit or miss. I was, like I said, I was just talking to a friend of mine who's tribal secretary, and he said they were talking about you have, or his wife actually she was the one I was talking to. She says you have people that are being proactive and engaging this, and then there's other people that are saying, well, from a traditional point of view, we don't look at addressing illness in that way.
Mm-hmm.
We have our own ways, we have our own medicines. And so that—
The reason I was asking is, of course, that could kind of help bring back some of that cultural connectedness, but it's also hard to, it's hard to get people to trust.
Well, I think a lot of it
for a good reason.
varies from community to community. So for example, when this the outbreak first happened, I saw some really beautiful things happen in Indigenous communities up in Canada. And these different elders coming together and bringing out old recipes, literally for like teas and medicines that hadn't been used since the Spanish flu, the Spanish influenza came through. And so they started bringing these things out. And then they also talked about how they framed those quarantines and isolation from how they historically responded to some of those things. And they did what they call was going into the bush. So when those flu pandemics were coming through in 1918 and all of that, many of those people just left urban areas and went back out to the forest, went back to their trap lines, and went back to a subsistence living for a couple of years. And it was through that they were able to avoid contact with those who would have been carriers. So that was an example of them going back to, I guess, lessons from their past. And even the idea of within, like, let's say sweat lodges, right? One of the ceremonies up there that they used a lot. They're like, there was a time because of religious persecution and oppression that those things were done privately and only within the immediate family, wasn't for the larger community or village. And it says, we can take that time that using those strategies was how we were able to persist and continue with our spiritual practices and keep ourselves safe. They said, now that's what we have to do again, but in terms of this virus, this pandemic, using those similar types of things. So I've seen really interesting and beautiful ways. Many different people have couched responses to this pandemic, utilizing, I guess, reframing it in a historical context. This is how we dealt with past challenges, and this is how we were able to survive. So we're just going to apply those things to this context. Even like some of the communities in New Mexico, when there was a lot of oppression before, 1978 is when they passed that Freedom of Religion Act for Native Americans. And so a lot of ceremonies were really quiet. There was a secrecy about them, and non-outsiders, outsiders were not non-community members weren't allowed in. And so they went back to that. There's a lot of openness, intertribal, sharing of stuff. But during this pandemic, it's like, okay, we got to go back to that. Only people from this community, only people from this little, neighborhood are going to be involved. One of the other things I just thought about as far as something that's affecting specific communities is over these past couple years is Hispanic communities, because of the negative vitriol that was coming about, anti-immigrant vitriol that was coming out, that has really impacted a lot of Hispanic communities as well. You know, even down to the shooting that happened in the Walmart in El Paso, Texas. You know, specifically that somebody was going out there to shoot these immigrants. And the sad thing is, amongst all the Hispanic people that were killed, not one of them was an immigrant. They were all US citizens. You know, so that's another level of trauma that that's kind of more community specific.
Yeah.
And the next question that we have, so knowing that trauma is ongoing, knowing that it's happening in various communities, it's happening collectively. Dr. Rupert, what are some tangible coping skills that folks can use when they're feeling particularly overwhelmed or escalated?
So I talk about, if you're in a marginalized group, you have permission to detach, you have permission to turn off the news. Obviously, I can't make anybody not do it. But generally, if you're not in a marginalized group, I think it's more of your duty to stay engaged. But if you're in a marginalized group and you need to detach and take breaks, naturally you should do that regularly. I run groups on Facebook, so it's actually really hard for me to take social media breaks. But even then, sometimes I just at least delete the app from my phone, so I have to go on my computer to use it. And so I'm just not bombarded with notifications constantly. I haven't watched the news in a while. Like, I get my news from Facebook or from looking on the CNN app. I just had to, I can't even watch SVU right now. And I love SVU. I love some Arista, but it's just all trauma. Like, I just can't do it right now. So taking a break from what you can take a break from. Then finding your people. So especially if you're living, like I live in Minnesota, it's obviously not a very diverse place. So finding other Black people for me to connect with was really, really important. I think happened about 2 years into me living here, and it really kind of changed my ability to tolerate being here. But so finding your people, and sometimes, like I said, that's sometimes where online communities come in, because sometimes if you live in a really, really small town, you're not going to physically find your people. So you find your people online. Sorry, the question was tangible ways to handle constant trauma, right?
Yeah, or tangible coping skills when you're feeling overwhelmed or escalated.
I do have some slides at the end just with some resources, so I'll maybe show that at the end, and then you guys can email it out. So that has a lot of tangible, like, coping skills that I could go over. But other things that aren't on there is, like I said, finding community, giving yourself permission to take a break. I think those are really the main two that's not on, like, the slides I'll discuss later. But those two are really important, though. I think those are two of the most important, is basically protecting, boundaries. Which this is, I mean, those are part of boundaries, right? But I think people forget truly how important boundaries are. Saying no, like just putting things in place and sticking to that, and, you know, not letting people run over your boundaries. Like, I can handle, so obviously as a psychiatrist, I hear trauma all day. I have trauma myself. My kids are adopted, so they have trauma plus their special needs. So there's only so much additional trauma I could take on, right? So, and I also run groups that are about anti-racism. So I'm listening to all that. So I might hear, you know, one additional thing. Okay, I can listen to this story. I can help out. I can, you know, what's the word? I can spread the word on this, but it's not like I don't care about the millions of other stories that's going across, but I have to, you know, I have to have that boundary to protect myself. So giving yourself permission to have boundaries.
Yeah, I think that's really important. Yeah, I think that's an important note to transition from, but I think especially throughout this year, I feel like I've heard and had a lot of conversations about boundary setting and about just what that looks like for different people, whether that's, turning off your phone notifications at 8 p.m. so you can actually unwind for the day, or really sticking to, I answer emails from this time to this time and I'm not checking it after that, or I'm really forcing myself not to engage after a certain hour. I even saw, like, recently some other colleagues who work in other higher ed settings, that there was an expectation that you have to put away messages when the weekend comes around. And I was like, whoa, are we at that point? Like, come on. Like, if you don't work typically on the weekends, like, why is that your time away? That's just your time off. So I think boundaries are, extremely important. Teresa, anything to add for some tangible coping skills when people are feeling particularly overwhelmed or escalated?
Yeah, and so I'll just provide one. I have a couple types of tangible coping skills, but the main one I'll focus on is just self-validating. And so that just means that you listen to your feelings at that time without judgment. Right, when we are really struggling with something, sometimes it's hard to validate where we are at because we just want to be not feeling bad anymore, right? And so self-validating doesn't mean that you agree with what's going on, or that you necessarily approve of what is. It's just validating yourself with where you're at in that reality, and recognizing what is for you, even when it's hard, right? And so we can be spinning through emotions if we're in like a fight, flight, or freeze response. And so I think just validating and naming that emotion and giving it space to show up there, even as an uninvited guest, that self-validation can be sometimes that first step to then, okay, now I have that feeling named. And then I would say the next thing is kind of self-soothing. And self-soothing I think of as kind of as Dr. Rupert said, we really need to take that time to find what are those actual self-care things, right? So self-soothing, 5 senses, right? So smell something nice, put on, like, cook your favorite food that you really love the smell of, or cookies, something that reminds you of that. Maybe a song that reminds you of a good time, or that helps you express and cry something out, turning on a song instead of just having that feeling pent up. If you really need to ground yourself, pick a color and just where you're at, start naming everything that color in your environment until you can kind of find yourself back in the present where you're at. Touch can be as simple as putting giving yourself a bear hug, feeling the warmth of your hands on each other and sharing that. Right. And so all of those things, just keeping yourself a nice, cool glass of water, and sometimes just get you back into the moment, grounded, ready to kind of take care of yourself in the moment as you are.
Bringing up those examples reminds me of, personally, I like to have cry showers, where then after, when the shower is done, usually the crying is ended and I'm feeling refreshed and ready to move on. But that's I'd like literally name, like, okay, I'm gonna go have a little cry shower now. So yeah, I appreciate you bringing up those specific examples, and I'll just bear my experience that's what I do. So Jeff, any other pieces to add for some coping skills when people are feeling overwhelmed or escalated?
One of the things I think that compounds the trauma that we're all experiencing, on top of some of the world events, climate events, social events, is the isolation that COVID has created. And we're social beings. At the core, we're pack predators, right? That's how we survived. The old people say, human beings in some of the stories were the last ones created because we're the most pitiful. We have no claws or fur. We're not very fast, very strong. And a lot of the traditional teachings would say, and we're not very smart. So we have to learn from the other animals and things like that. But it's through community that we have survived. It's through working together with other people that we are able to live. And so from the moment we're born, you know, human infants are oriented towards making connections with their primary caregivers, right? Looking into their face, co-regulating with their mother or whoever it is that's their nurturer. I mean, we're not like lizards that just get born out of an egg and just go on our own, right? We need other people. And so even more so in this time of isolation, finding ways to connect. This is more of a generational thing, because boy, I'm sorry, I don't mean to slam on the millennials, but it's like some of the CNAs and RNs that I work with, right? They're like, I want to talk. They'll text me. I'm like, come funny, just get on the phone and talk to me. You know, it's like, but there's power in healing, in hearing a human voice that doesn't come through text or that kind of media. And I know we get burnt out on these the Zoom things. Zooms are great because at least you can see facial expressions. But if you're burned out on that, just having a small handful of people that you know you can call and just talk to, not about necessarily any kind of problem, but just say, hey, how was your day? Oh, I was thinking about this the other day, or whatever. Maybe it might be someone you can share your problems with, but just having a human voice, because that helps us with that co-regulation. I mean, it's just such an instinctual, visceral need that we all have. The second thing I would say is, don't forget about the power of being in nature. Even if you're in the city, just going and sitting next to a tree, listening to the birds, you know, chirp, watching puppies play or something, or squirrels run around, or I don't know. In New York City, it might be rats, but whatever it is, just some other living being. Because again, for, you know, hundreds of thousands of years, that's how our, you know, biome was connected to the earth. Now we live in this artificially disconnected environment of, you know, in four walls and things like that. So just getting out into nature, you know, feeling the wind on your face, you know, smelling the fresh air, taking deep breaths, all of those things can be profoundly anchoring, centering, just to get back to the core of what it means to be a human being on this planet. And along with all the other wonderful things my two colleagues just said, do those things too. But just, you know, thinking of what else to add. But those are yeah, that I would recommend. Hearing a voice, an actual human voice, and getting to nature in whatever way you can.
Yeah, thank you. And for those of us in the Midwest, I hope maybe this past week has allowed us to do that a little bit more than our previous months. So yeah. We have one more question for our panelists tonight, and then we can move on to some Q&A. Or I also know that Teresa has prepared a little exercise for us if we feel that that would be beneficial for us too. So my last question, Dr. Rupert, what has been missing from mental health conversations, and what are some lessons learned from this collective trauma that we could use moving forward?
Okay, this I could talk about all day, but I'm not. Missing from mental health conversations, cultural competence, spirituality, and Jeff hit a lot on this on the other event we attended together, but so psychiatry, the history of psychiatry is actually incredibly racist, incredibly racist. I was listening, there's a book called Neurotribes, and it's really talking about the history of autism. And it talks about how basically the diagnostic criteria we have for autism now is what they originally had, and then they kind of narrowed it into the stereotypical autistic quality for political reasons, all that. But in listening to that book, it talks about how psychiatry, the United States psychiatry, was one of the leading people with eugenics. Germany borrowed a lot from us. They borrowed very heavily from us on basically everything they did, because go United States, we're super racist here. And I said all that to say that, so now psychiatrists that and mental health providers, therapists, counselors, all of that need to know that history and need to understand that even the latest DSM we have is still really written from a white male point of view for the most part. And it's written on a deficit model. So it's like all the things wrong is determines what you have. And it's not really written from a, I'm sorry, I can't think of words today, from the perspective of how this has helped community. So like, let's talk about ADHD, for example. ADHD, we diagnosed it based on all the things kids can't do, right? But ADHD has been passed down from generation to generation because it's protective in some ways, as far as like it's more likely to occur in people that are intelligent. It helps with creativity. So those are the people, and same with autism. So those are the people that are like inventing things and all of those kind of things. So there's these positive things that we don't talk about in psychiatry. So said all of that to say, psychiatry has to bring the truth to the table, right? Like we need to confront our past. We need to be culturally competent. We need to understand that we're working from a deficit model. So like when I talk to my patients, I'm like, this is the criteria I have to go by, but this is what this means in the big picture. And these are some of the good things about it. And, you know, you have to basically try as much as you can to fix the racism of psychiatry. The other thing, one example I have is, this is a cultural example. I'm from the South, like I said. And in the South, even if you're not religious, you talk about God and the devil a lot. So it could be like your car breaks down and you're like, the devil caused my car to break down. No one actually thinks like the devil literally caused their car to break down. But I remember I was working at a clinic, and one of the people there who was not culturally competent and just kind of how we are in the South was diagnosing everyone with schizophrenia because they talked to God or the devil. And I was like, they not actually talking, you know, I mean, they might be talking to, you know, they might be praying, talking to God, but they're not actually you know, they were not hallucinating. They were not psychotic. So there's a lot of history of Black people, Indigenous people getting like those psychotic diagnoses instead of mood disorders because of just not being culturally competent. There was a time when I was an intern actually, and my attending was seeing a Black male who definitely had depression, was inpatient. And he just talked very colloquial. Like at that time, it was a whole bunch of, you know how they used to say, you know, all the time, and they never really said what they knew. Like it was just like ending things with a question. And so my attendant was like, oh, he has to have like schizophrenia because he's not putting his thoughts together. And I was like, no, that's just the way young people talk. So he was about to get a diagnosis of schizophrenia just from, you know, the psychiatrist not being culturally competent, when really he just had depression and probably trauma, you know, complex trauma. So I say all that to say we have to do better about looking at the whole person and looking at not just deficits, but their culture, who they are, what their experiences are, and coming from a whole holistic place.
Yeah, I put this in the chat, but I don't know. Maybe I just haven't heard it enough, but I love the idea of just thinking about, yeah, like instead of what are people not bringing to the table, like what are they bringing to the table, or acknowledging the both and. I think that is so important. So I really appreciate you bringing that up. Teresa, what do you feel has been missing from mental health conversations, and what are some lessons learned from this collective trauma that we could use moving forward?
There's several lessons, I think. on the societal scale, so from a social work perspective, we always look at problems, not only like how is an individual functioning, but how is a community also lacking the resources to support the functioning of individuals, right? And so many times we apply labels to individuals when really they're in dysfunctional systems. And so we have really lacked a systemic discussion about how do we treat mental health as if it were a public health crisis. There have been for a long time, I think, a pandemic in the mental health world, how we talk about a pandemic increasing of suicidal ideation, and especially for young people and for a lot of marginalized people, we know this pandemic of trauma as well. And so, how are we talking about it as a systemic thing that's affecting communities and not that an individual doesn't have the right coping, right? Actually, no, there is nothing wrong with you if you are in a system that's treating you poorly and you don't know what to do next. It doesn't mean you failed. It doesn't mean you will always feel that way. It doesn't mean you're unworthy. You are enough. And so, how do we look at making systems work for people and not the other way around? I think also what's been missing is really, we need to pass the mic and also pass the offering plate and make sure that we are paying mental health and other people of marginalized identities for their service and their education, and for individuals who have privilege learning that there are tough days and things happen when you continue to stay engaged. And this is a human rights issue, right? And this matters because it is other humans, and I will make the time for this. And so knowing when you commit to that trauma-informed model, you're really committing to a lifestyle of actions where you are continually engaging in that self-reflection and practice to move yourself forward into that growth and taking those courageous steps on to something else, and being grateful for the lessons along the way, knowing also that, other people are on their journey, and so finding where they're at to help them move forward as well.
Thank you. Yeah, I love you bringing up the not always focusing on like what's wrong with the individual, but what's wrong with the society or the structures around them. Yeah, that was really important because I think that sometimes, yeah, it does feel like, am I just a burden or am I doing something wrong? And I think it's important to recognize, no, there's just a lot wrong with the world that you're in and how that impacts individuals. So I really appreciate that. Jeff, so what do you feel has been missing from mental health conversations, and what are some lessons learned moving forward?
One of the things I appreciate what Dr. Rupert shared was that the history of psychology is pretty racist. The other thing that I would add to that is that the history of psychology isn't very extensive. It's only been kind of figuring some stuff out for maybe 100, 150 years. It doesn't have a lot of, it doesn't have a lot of depth, especially when compared to other cultural perspectives. And so I think that allowing ourselves to break out of that that paradigm that somehow this is the epitome and the penultimate of development of understanding of human beings and the way that they function, that's a paradigm worth challenging. I shared with our group, the last panel discussion, I said, when a culture persists for 10,000 years, they can't do that without having some pretty good ideas on how to deal with the crap that human beings have to, that comes up in life. I mean, it's not like trauma just showed up. I tell a lot of times when I speak to indigenous peoples or people, Hispanic, they're still indigenous, didn't just show up 500 years ago when somebody got lost and found their way over here. Trauma existed before that. 500 years ago, 600 years ago, some little 14-year-old kid, he's gonna be a man. He's gonna go out and get some food from the family and goes out into the forest and gets mauled by a bear. That's a traumatized individual. But in small communities or village life, there's no throwaways. Nobody can be thrown away. And so they had to find a way to help that person integrate that experience into a strength for themselves. And so what are those practices that allowed somebody to take such a horrible thing like being mauled by a bear and turn it into something that's a strength for them to be able to persist and continue? So it behooves us to question, what were those things that allowed a culture to exist for 10,000 years without imploding or self-destructing? And probably something that we can learn from that. And so there's a reframing from this kind of deficit model, like Dr. Rupert and Ms. Miller were talking about, to looking at strengths. And so an example of this is, within the current idea, I guess Western scientific epistemologies, is that there's this ideal manifestation of a thing, right? And then based upon that ideal, everything else is evaluated on how it doesn't meet that. And so when you look at an animal that's lacking melanin, right, albinism, we say, oh, it's an albino, right? That's a deficit model. It's missing this gene, it's missing that, whatever, But some cultures look at that and say, all the other deer, this kind of color, the creator made that one different. Maybe we need to pay attention to that one. There's something that one has to teach us. It's not a deficit. It's that one is unique. And so we can learn from that unique one. I was working, doing some volunteer work at a place called Inside Out Youth Services here in Colorado Springs, which is an LGBTQ drop-in center for kids, and a lot of street kids. And there was a young girl that was there that was, she was from the Northern Cheyenne tribe. She was homeless because her parents were very kind of evangelical in their orientation when they found out that she identified as lesbian. They kicked her out on the street. So I talked to her about that cultural perspective that, there's 500 nations, so obviously there's lots of different variations of this, but just in general, this idea of two-spiritedness. And I said, from a traditional point of view, people that were two-spirited were seen to have a unique gift from the creator. And so sometimes they became the counselors, they became the storytellers, they became the keepers of tradition. I said, it was explained to me by one elder that I talked to, that in the way that the universe works, there's these opposites, male and female, that come together to create life. But that in two-spirited people, they have both of those gifts within them, male and female. So they don't look for their opposite. They look for a companion, someone that understands them in this journey of life. And the thing that they create might not be physical life, but oftentimes those things which make life beautiful, whether it's music or art, or the stories or the songs, or the keeping of traditions, or all the other different roles that sometimes these people took within traditional societies. And so it's a way of, again, that there's no throwaways. Every single person has value. And so I think that that's something that contemporary Western psychology can benefit from. We now call it, in our not modern epistemology, strengths-based models. So that's good. But that's what I share sometimes with these young people. It's like, yeah, now we're, in Western psychology, we're starting to catch up with this. But these are things that some cultures have known for thousands and thousands of years. And so I think that could be beneficial. And that's also the thing I encourage people of all traditions, of all backgrounds, is connect with those, that deep ancestral wisdom that predates this modern, post-industrial mess that we live in now. That a long time ago, there was ways that people figured these things out. And I'm not just saying that this is just a phenomenon in North America or Africa. It's happened in Asia, it happened in Europe. I mean, same thing. There's got to be 1,000 years ago, some village, there's a kid that was traumatized. How do you help that person? You don't throw anybody away. Every single person's contribution is an important thing to harness and to cultivate. And there's ways of traditionally that families and community came together. And I think that would be my answer to that question of what has this pandemic shown us, or what do we learn from this, is the importance of interconnection, the importance of community, the importance of relationship. And that's one of the beautiful things for some of you that are familiar with, it's a Lakota term, but they end their ceremonies, their prayers, whatever, what they say, "Mitakuye Asin," which means all my relations. And a lot of other cultures have that kind of a sentiment, is that we're all connected, we're all related. And I think that this pandemic has really reinforced that something that may have started on one side of the planet can affect us all the way on the other side. We're all connected, we're all related, and we need to care about each other in that way. We can't, these artificial boundaries of borders and language and culture and whatever, those are just up here, right? What's going on in here, that's what really makes us human beings and connects us all. That's my thoughts.
Thank you so much, Jeff, and thank you to the other panelists as well. I feel like that was a very beautiful way to end, and I really appreciated all of your perspectives throughout this. I think selfishly, like listening to you all, I was like, maybe I just needed this event. Like maybe I created this for myself. I don't know. Either way, at least you all are along for the ride. I know we have some time left here with each other tonight, so I do want to see were any questions submitted to either Frank or Kaden, or giving also an invitation to our group if you'd like to unmute yourselves and ask a question as well. I want to give some time to do that.
Yeah, I don't know if it's much of a question or a comment or a brain dump or what have you, but first, just like say, really appreciate everybody and the panel, and very, very inspiring words, and I think very impactful words. One of the things I was wondering about, and it was one of the comments very early on, I think Dr. Rupert indicated this, was the positives and negatives of the social media, and not only social media, even sometimes media in of itself. And is there any words of wisdom, if you will, in that sometimes with social media and looking at friends and Facebook or what have you, you come across this drivel that is extremely frustrating. And one of the things that just came up just recently was, again, this Blue Lives Matter thing, and it's not in the context of Blue Lives Matter, it's in the context of that being derogatory or what have you towards the Black Lives Matter movement, right? And you see that and you just get so frustrated, right? And and then I think I shared with some of the folks here before, even like I really like NPR, but sometimes I just have to shut it off because it gets depressing, right? And and I'm not a depressed guy. I mean, folks know me, I'm a pretty happy guy, but it's just, those things get really frustrating, really challenging at times. So again, kind of a brain dump, and just words of wisdom are appreciated.
I think just with social media, and sometimes I get caught up in this, like I think if you choose to engage, just engage with the understanding that you may or may not change that person's mind, but it's going to be other people reading who will learn. I do best when I take a step back and kind of I call it the passive aggressive troll. Although I'm not actually trolling, because I get really passionate about things. So if I'm like really arguing, like I'm like in there, But and people do learn from that. I have people who inbox me and are like, I love, hearing this. You've taught me so much. But that also takes a toll on me, right? That takes an emotional toll on me. So sometimes when I'm going through those breaks and I still want to engage, I am not passive aggressive. I'm not good at it at all. So I've been like perfecting I've been using this to perfect my technique. And I just kind of really step back and answer things, I guess kind of like I'm at work. Like I kind of, if I can, like if it's something that I'm not super triggered by, I answer things. I'm a psychiatrist, so I kind of use it to think about that. If I'm at work, so, oh, this seems to really bother you. Like, why are you so upset that someone wants a living wage, So it's kind of that making them explain their racism, and it generally gets people really frustrated and they normally just go away because, it's kind of like the tip. I think I've heard, I forgot where I heard this, but it's like the tip that a lot of women hear for sexism. Like if somebody tells you a sexist joke or an inappropriate joke, you pretend like you don't get it. And you're like, oh, well, what's funny? What's the joke? Like, and then they have to explain, exactly what they're talking about. And that's super awkward. And, so using that approach, when I don't have the energy to like truly engage, it's still a way to provide information for other people, but not get into that emotional drain that I'm in. And then sometimes just not engaging, just cutting it off. Like you can do that too. But, like I said, there's always, I have found a lot. I've gotten, like I said, I run a group for anti-racism, and I'm in a whole bunch of physician groups, and there are a lot of racist physicians, guys. Let me just tell you. I'm pretty sure y'all know, but let me just tell you. So, I have gotten a lot of messages inbox about now how many people I've gotten a lot of messages from people who I was not engaging with, who read that and was like, this really, started me on my journey. This caused me to get this book or get this book. So people are listening and people are learning, even though it's probably not the person you're actually engaging with. Other people are listening and learning. And I think that's kind of important to keep in the back of your mind, is that people actually are changing. Because, everyone says no one changes somebody's mind from a Facebook argument, but that's not true. You might change the person you're arguing with mind, but you might be changing someone else's mind.
Thank you.
Any others, questions or thoughts, feedback for our panelists?
One thing I thought about that I've shared with some of, this comes up a lot with the work that I do with hospice, because sometimes the caregivers are already just overwhelmed and like, I don't get it. Usually I can manage this, and I just broke down and I'm crying, or, I blew up and I yelled at my husband and it's really not his fault. And one of the metaphors I share with them, I said, it's, over here we have this little lake called Pueblo Reservoir. I said, you guys know where Pueblo Reservoir is, right? And they go, yeah. I said, imagine if you're at the edge of the lake, standing in about chin deep in the water, to your shins, or you're just below your knees, and, light breeze is coming by and these little 2-inch waves are coming lapping on. How do you feel when you think about that? Like, oh, that's just so, calming and soothing. I'm like, yeah, it's what a beautiful experience, right? Put your feet in the water. I said, now imagine you're in the middle of the lake and you're this deep in the water. And now you have this 2-inch wave coming at you. Every single wave is life-threatening. It's not the size of the wave. It has to do with how deep in the water you are. And then that's why sometimes even small things, I think like stuff we read on social media or something you see on the news, or you think you got it together and you hear like, I saw that paddling that Dr. Rupert was talking about. I was like, my head just went, it's like, okay, that's all I need this morning. I'm done. And I'm usually pretty a calm guy, but I was like, and maybe because I used to be a school teacher, I'm like, how do you do that to a child? I mean, we're taught, in traditional ways, you don't beat a dog or a horse or an animal. Why are you going to beat a child? There's no reason for that. There's never an appropriate reason for that, at least from that cultural perspective, right? So, and I know there's certain things like that will trigger me. It's like, no, you don't beat that child. You're not going to beat your dog. You're not going to beat your horse. You're not going to beat an animal. You don't beat a child. But it was that little wave for me this morning, that little video, and it was like, put me over the edge for a little bit. I had to go outside and just take a couple deep breaths, get myself recentered to be able to engage with my next patients. So those types of things, as you share with your friends or colleagues or whatever, they feel sometimes overwhelmed. It's just, not to get down on themselves and like, why did I overreact to such a little bitty thing? It's not that thing. It's just everything else was already this deep in the lake. That's my thought.
I think that's a really nice visual. Deirdre, did you want to share anything?
I'd love to ask a question of Dr. Rupert in terms of the cultural competence and any thoughts that you might have on assisting counselors or counselors in training. We have been reading within our department here on campus, we've been reading a lot of things that have kind of challenged the typical effort of cultural competence, taking a class in your master's degree, right? Attending a conference, maybe something like that. But we really see that so many of that just really is an empty effort in terms of cultural competence. So I'd love to hear just a few words or thoughts that you might have about other ways that we can approach that cultural competency.
So I will share a book that I helped write a chapter on. It's called Sociocultural Issues in Psychiatry. And it's by Tran and Chan are the main authors. But like I said, I helped write a book. But what I really think has been the most helpful for me, this is where social media has probably been the most helpful for me, is following or joining groups that are led by people who have that thing. So, if I'm in an autistic group, I try to be in autistic groups that's autistic centered, Black groups that are Black centered, LGBTQ groups that are LGBTQ centered. A lot, especially like the developmental stuff, it's a lot of those groups are parent centered and not centered on like the person. And I just kind of develop a rule that I listen to the I call it the most privileged voice, but it's really the least privileged voice for that point of view, right? So the most privileged voice to me is who I need to listen to. So even like as a physician, yeah, I know how to diagnose autism. I know how to diagnose ADHD. I know how to diagnose depression. I know what is something I have all of those things. So let me pick something I don't have. I know how to diagnose bipolar disorder. I for sure don't have that. But I don't know how that feels, right? Like I can't experience that. So that's where I listen to bipolar people describe their mania to me. And I'm not like, I'm the doctor. I know it all. I read the DSM. I'm the one who's telling you you're bipolar. I can't experience this like that. So I think listening and, if you're in a place where you can't, go out and join the LGBT group, a Black group, or autism group. That's where like online and social media, following people on Twitter, all those things can really come in handy because you learn the lived experience.
I like that. Thank you so much.
I know that we are getting close to time. Teresa, how long was your exercise? I'm wondering if that would be a good way to wrap us up or if it is too long.
No, it would probably take about 5 minutes.
Okay. Well, and if folks aren't feeling comfortable, you don't have to stay, but I think that I just want to thank our panelists here tonight and thank all of the participants for being here. Thanks for those who are going to watch in the future. I know we've gotten some emails and messages about watching the recording. But I think I'll just end us here with turning things over to Teresa, and she has an exercise to kind of ground us for the rest of our evening.
All right, everyone. So feel free at this time if you want to keep your cameras on or if you feel more comfortable, cameras off. But we are going to do just a slight meditation. And today our focus will be on befriending your body. So calmly just lower your gaze and find yourself a comfortable seated position. Uncross your legs. Let yourself rest where you are sitting. Take a breath in through your nose. And as you exhale, let your exhale move out in a thin, slow stream of air. Let yourself feel any sense of settling in and ease as you exhale. Become aware of your body. If you notice labels or judgments, just acknowledge them. Keep breathing. Drop your shoulders. Open your jaw. We often spend so much time with our body doing that we forget to be with our inner selves. Move beyond thinking of your body as just its external experience and experience the fullness of yourself. Sense your heart and your lungs. Consider what your body does daily. Our muscles and skeleton allow us to move from place to place as well as to dance. Your body is extraordinary. Scan your body for things that you like. All of us are wired genetically in unique ways. In what ways do you soothe your body? Kindly embrace yourself. Hug your body if that feels good. Recall the ways that your body feels during moments of pleasure. Your body is powerful beyond measure. Consider this. Your skin replaces itself once a month. Your stomach lining every 5 days. Your liver is renewed every 6 weeks. And your skeleton every 3 months. A scar on your skin tells a story about a time in your life where you were hurt and your body healed, yet it remembers. Thank your body for how it continues to take care of you, year in, over and over. You also take care of your body. You take it for walks. You write out its feelings. You breathe. You sing. Our bodies are the canvases upon which our internal being expresses itself. Your body is not an ornament. It is an instrument of your life. Be patient and gentle with it. We can learn to befriend our bodies. As the vehicle to our dreams, our bodies are marvelous. By caring for your body, fueling it, respecting it, and honoring it, you care for this world. Your body matters. Your feelings matter. You are enough just in your being. Take a few deep breaths and just allow yourself to kind of gently reorient back to the moment. And thank you for this time to acknowledge, be sensitive with your body and your feelings. As we've gone through a really tough year, our bodies carry that around. It presents with us when we know it or not. And so thanks for taking that time and a little brief moment to check in.
Thank you so much, Teresa. And thank you all for being here tonight. Hope that was a nice calming way to get through the rest of your evening. Yeah, thank you so much and have a good rest of your night.
Thank you, you as well.
Thank you.
And thanks again to our 3 panelists.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you all for being here.
Thank you for inviting. Take care.
Bye.
Bye, Jeff.
Bye.